The old woman's bedroom stood before us, the door sealed tight. The brass knob was frozen stiff. I gripped it with my glove, twisted hard, but it refused to budge. Whether it was locked by man or something darker, I couldn't tell. From beyond, the door came faint noises, whispered voices layered over each other, speaking words I couldn't quite understand. It wasn't English, or maybe it was, twisted into something broken and wrong. Either way, it scraped against my mind like a splinter under the skin. I pounded on the door with the side of my fist. "Open up!" The door rattled in its frame, vibrating, like something was twisting the knob from the other side. I stepped back. Whatever waited beyond that door wasn't going to open it for us. I unclipped the small silver crucifix from around my neck, the one my mother had clutched on her deathbed. I pressed it against the door. "Release the door," I commanded, voice low but steady. "In the name of Christ, let us in." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the crucifix grew warm in my hand, pulsing as if it were fighting something invisible. There was a sharp crack, and the door swung inward with a groan. The three of us stood frozen, staring into the gloom. The old woman's room was lit by guttering candles, their flames warped and shuddering as if gasping for air. Bones, human bones, decorated the walls and dangled from the rafters on bits of string. Blood dripped steadily from somewhere above, forming black puddles on the warped floorboards. The fireplace, black with soot, hissed suddenly, and then a roar of sickly green flames erupted, bathing the room in a warped, hellish glow. The smell hit us next, a mix of burned flesh, rot, and old blood. It coated the inside of my throat, making it hard to breathe. And then she stepped into view. The crone. She shuffled from behind a crumbling armoire, stooped and twitching, her hair a matted mess hanging around her sunken face. Her skin was sagging and gray, mottled with old bruises and scars. A thick purple rope burn circled her neck like a noose she hadn't escaped. She moved toward us, her clawed hands twitching at her sides. "You boys come looking for a friend," she rasped. Her voice was like metal scraping over bone. "Wide-eyed little lambs, you'll be sheep for the slaughter." I gripped my rifle tighter. The hag cocked her head in a jerky, unnatural way, then began to speak in a sing-song rhyme. "From cold earth I have come, because you young ones seek some. But what you seek is not here, so be gone lest you disappear." The words dripped from her lips like venom. "Where's Rowan?" I shouted. She ignored the question, turning her back to us and circling the room in a slow, twitching shuffle. Her clawed fingers scraped along the walls, tracing shapes in the dust and blood. "You seek what is claimed," she hissed. "He belongs to the cold ground now." Jesse lifted his rifle and fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the small room. The bullet punched through the crone's chest and passed through like mist. She didn't even flinch. "You cannot harm." "What is already dead," she whispered. Then her body began to unravel, coming apart like smoke caught in a whirlwind. In a heartbeat, she was gone, leaving only the reeking air and the echo of her laughter. But before the last of her form dissolved, she pointed one bony finger toward the fire pit outside. A sound rose from beyond the house, a human cry, hoarse and desperate. Rowan. We didn't wait. We bolted from the house, stumbling down the sagging porch steps and into the swirling snow. The wind ripped at us, but we pushed forward toward the pit behind the cabin, and there he was. Rowan was dragging himself from the pit on hands and knees, covered in soot and ash. His clothes were scorched, his face raw and chapped, but he was alive. Melvin reached him first, dropping to his knees to haul him free. Jesse and I were right behind him. Rowan collapsed into our arms, gasping for breath. He was half frozen, disoriented, but he was breathing. When he finally found his voice, he whispered, "The house. She wouldn't let me leave." He passed out before he could say more. We barely gave Rowan a moment's rest. Fear still gnawed at us, and every instinct screamed that the house wasn't finished with us yet. Melvin and Jesse lifted Rowan between them, half carrying him as we made our way back through the rotting structure. His legs were too weak to support him, His head lolled against Jesse's shoulder, but his breathing stayed steady. We hadn't found him inside the house proper. He'd been outside, in that cursed pit, but we still needed to finish what we started. The last room we hadn't checked was the old woman's bedroom. We moved fast down the warped hallway, the boards under our boots creaking. The deeper we went, the stronger the stench of rot and old blood became. As we passed the doorway to the crone's room, a low moan rose from within, and we froze. The door to the bedroom hung open on broken hinges, swinging slightly in the cold drafts. Inside, the room flickered with the sick light of candles that hadn't burned out yet, their flames guttering against the darkness. Bones still decorated the room, lashed together with bits of twine. Blood smeared the walls in crude symbols that seemed to writhe when you looked at them too long. The fireplace sat black and dead, ashes heaped high, and there she was, the hag. She stood in the center of the room, hunched and shuddering, her hair hanging in greasy ropes around her face. The purple scar from her noose gleamed in the candlelight. In one clawed hand, she held a small silver bell, its delicate jingle sounding sickly sweet in the silence. She grinned at us, lips peeling back to reveal cracked, blackened teeth. "You dare return?" she rasped. Her voice was different this time, not mocking or sing-song. It was filled with rage and hunger. "You trespass on ground consecrated to the old ones," she hissed. "You seek what is not yours to claim." I stepped forward, lifting the crucifix from around my neck. "You have no claim here anymore," I said. "You and yours are done." The crone threw back her head and laughed, a hideous, wet-sounding cackle. "You think your petty faith will save you?" she said. "The ground drinks blood. It remembers." The hag began chanting in a language that curled the edges of my mind. The candle flames shot up, burning green and blue. Melvin stumbled back, his face ashen. "We have to end this," I said, through gritted teeth. I thrust the crucifix forward. A shriek tore through the room, a sound so sharp and high it rattled the loose boards under our feet. The crone's body shimmered, blurring at the edges. "You will pay for this," she screamed. "Another winter, another storm, another will come." Her form twisted and stretched unnaturally before exploding into a cloud of black ash that whipped around the room and vanished up the dead chimney. The candles guttered, out at once, plunging us into cold darkness. A deep, resonant boom rumbled under our boots, as if something ancient had shifted in the foundations of the earth itself. We didn't wait. We half-dragged, half-carried Rowan out of that cursed place, the boards groaning in protest under our weight. Outside, the air was clearer. The trees still stood gnarled and dead, but the house behind us sagged lower, almost defeated. We didn't speak as we made our way back down the slope toward the safety of home. But none of us could shake the feeling that we hadn't destroyed the evil in that place. We had only delayed it. The morning sun rose weak and pale over the mountain, and we didn't wait. None of us wanted to spend another minute near that cursed house. Rowan was in rough shape, disoriented, shivering, his skin waxy and pale, but alive. He clung to us weakly as we made our slow way down the slope toward home. The fresh air seemed to help clear his head a little. By the time we reached my cabin, he was able to sit up on his own, wrapped tight in a blanket and sipping hot broth from a tin cup. We asked him questions carefully, not wanting to overwhelm him. He remembered very little. Fragments, mostly. Wandering, lost in the blizzard, seeing a faint light through the storm, climbing through a broken window to escape the cold, and then darkness. No memory of how he ended up buried in the fire pit. No memory of the hag, or of the horrors we had faced inside. Those rotting walls, just a lingering exhaustion, a terror he couldn't name. It was enough. By silent agreement, we didn't push him further. We had our own memories to wrestle with. Later that afternoon, once Rowan was asleep by the stove, Jesse, Melvin, and I gathered outside in the brittle cold. We stood in silence, staring up toward the blackened line of dead trees where the Milton house still squatted like a festering wound on the mountainside. "We can't leave it standing," Melvin said quietly. "No," I agreed. The church elders had warned us years ago after the original Milton disaster. They said the evil tied to that place was bound inside its walls, and that destroying it might unleash something worse. But what we had seen, and what we had fought, proved otherwise. That house wasn't containing anything anymore. It was feeding something. The disappearance. The loud, concussive knocks at my front door in the early hours of August 27, 1933, jolted me awake. Nobody would disturb me at that hour unless something serious had happened. An accident, an emergency, or a tragedy. The weather had been brutal, and traveling through the winter's bite could leave a man half dead. Between the bed and the door, every step hurt. A swollen cyst the size of an egg throbbed on my wrist, and arthritis had me hobbling like a half-crippled mole. The wine I'd drunk before bed dulled my senses, leaving me groggy and disoriented. Strange sounds and half-formed fears crowded my mind. Only something unnatural could be out there, I thought. Something ancient, something rising from the dark. Managed to tie my robe around my waist and stumbled to the door. Just as I turned the lock and pulled it open, a voice cut through the cold. It was Jesse Barry from down the hill, gruff, worn down but honest. A true mountain man, though the bottle had done him no favors. "Bradley, we got a problem, Rowan's gone missing," Jesse said, his voice strained, the muscles in his neck pulled tight. "Missing? Was he out in this mess?" I asked, meaning the storm. He was. Now he's lost. He never came home. His wife, Jennifer, sent word to me. "He's hours overdue," Jesse said, stomping snow from his boots before stepping inside to the warmth of the fire. "Let me throw more wood on," I said, grabbing a few logs from the pile beside the stove. I packed the old iron furnace and opened the flue. Flames roared to life. "That'll warm your bones," I said, settling into my rocking chair. "You know how Rowan is," Jesse said, shaking his head. "If he sees tracks, he'll chase them, no matter the weather." Jennifer said he spotted something near the cabin, grabbed his rifle, threw on just a couple layers, and headed out. That's the last she saw of him. "He's in for it if he doesn't find shelter," I said. "This storm's bigger than they predicted and it's not letting up." "Yeah, but Rowan's tough. Remember when he slept under a canoe for 2 days because he ran out of ammo and there was a bear sniffing around?" Jesse chuckled, though there wasn't much humor in it. "He wound up with malaria and deer ticks," I said. "Not the smartest man sometimes. I'm getting too old for this kind of thing myself. These days, getting out of bed is a gamble. I have to make sure if my feet hit the floor, the rest of me follows." Jesse gave a half-hearted chuckle but looked troubled. "First thing, we need a few more hours of sleep," I said. "The sun won't be up for at least 4 hours, and there's no point searching in the dark. The snow's wiped out any tracks. We'll have to go by what we know and hope it's enough. We can swing by Melvin's place, see if he wants to tag along. No sense calling in the sheriff yet." "Yeah," Jesse said. "Sheriff wouldn't want to make this climb anyway. Hell, he couldn't make it up the hill if he tried," I muttered. The thought of venturing out in this storm didn't sit well with me. We were risking our own lives, but Rowan was out there and he needed help. Still lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, all I could think about was him alone in that frozen wasteland. The image gnawed at me, until finally, sleep took hold. When I woke, the wind was still howling like a lone gray wolf outside. I already regretted moving. The weather was so bitter, even Jed, my old hound, refused to stir from his spot by the fire. I thought about bringing him along, but there was wisdom in letting sleeping dogs lie. He didn't so much as lift his head as I passed, and I left him be. Jesse and I packed heavy. We dressed in multiple layers, strapped on snowshoes, loaded our rifles, and carried enough water and supplies to last a while. Walking with the snowshoes was awkward, but without them, we would have been swallowed whole by the drifts. Weighted down and braced against the bitter cold, we set off into the storm. The snow had let up for the moment, but dark clouds were rolling back in. We figured we had a window before the weather got worse. We moved in a single file, Jesse leading and I following, working our way toward Rowan's cabin. It loomed ahead through the haze, half buried in the snow. We passed by it without stopping. Rowan wasn't home. We needed to head west. That meant heading toward the old Milton place. The thought alone made my skin crawl. The Miltons had earned a reputation on the mountain. Even as a boy, I'd heard the stories. Whispers of devil worship, witchcraft, dark magic, demons, and the so-called snake god. Their history had left a deep scar across the mountain folks' memories. I told myself we were just looking for shelter. Rowan might have reached, but deep down I hated the thought of going near that cursed property. As we pressed on, the forest seemed to close in around us. Snow-laden branches drooped low, creaking under their heavy loads. The wind whistled past my ears, carrying faint sounds that made the hair on my arms stand up. I heard voices. I stopped in my tracks and turned to Jesse. "You hear that?" He paused, listening. "Yeah," he said warily. We both strained to catch it. Whispers floated on the breeze. Hollow, broken, unintelligible words that seemed to surround us, then slip away just when we thought we understood them. We didn't speak. Again. There was no point. We trudged onward. A loud bellow behind us made me spin around, rifle halfway raised. It was Melvin, slogging up the trail behind us, bundled tight against the cold, carrying a pack nearly as big as he was. "We were about to come get you," I shouted over the wind. Melvin stomped up beside us, grinning despite the misery. "Heard about Rowan," he said, breathing hard. "Went to your place first, Bradley. Jennifer sent me after you." "You sure you want to come?" I asked. "We're heading toward the Milton place." Melvin shrugged, stamping snow off his boots. "Rowan's my friend, too. Besides, I'm not scared of old ghost stories." For a man his size, Melvin could move fast. Living on the mountain toughened a body or killed it. We pressed forward 3 strong. The going was slow. We talked now and again, mostly about the storm. Anything to keep from thinking about where we were headed, or what we might find. Nobody said it out loud, but we all knew the truth. We might be too late. Jesse pushed forward ahead of us. Suddenly, he stopped cold. Melvin and I barely avoided running into him. Jesse turned slowly, his face as pale as the snow underfoot. His skin seemed stretched tight across his skull, his eyes wide and vacant. "Jesse," I called out, feeling a jolt of fear I couldn't explain. Without answering, Jesse lurched forward, staggering through the snow like a puppet on broken strings. "Jesse," Melvin shouted after him. No response. Something unseen seemed to tug at him, pulling him faster than we could follow. There were no tracks ahead of him, no path in the snow, but he moved as if he was being dragged. We stumbled after him, slipping and sliding. The air around us seemed to grow thinner. My ears popped painfully. The pressure built until my chest felt like it might cave in. Then Jesse collapsed face first into the snow. The whispers returned, louder, swirling around us like a rising storm. Melvin dropped to his knees beside him. "Is he breathing?" he barked. I crouched down, checked. "Yeah, he's alive." We rolled Jesse onto his side. His eyes were clamped shut, his lips twisted into a grimace. His entire body trembled. "Jesse," I shouted, shaking his shoulder. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open. At first, there was no recognition there, only wildness. Then his gaze focused on me. "I saw them," he gasped. "The Miltons, sitting on the porch, waiting. I heard a man screaming like nothing human. You good to stand?" I asked, tightening my grip on his arm. "I think so," he muttered. With Melvin's help, we hauled him upright. He swayed, but steadied himself. None of us spoke about what had just happened. We pressed on, heading toward the place none of us wanted to reach. The Milton house was close now. I could feel it in my bones, and it wasn't just Rowan we were looking for anymore. Something else was waiting for us. The old Milton place was not much further, but everything was uphill and we were losing time. I thought back to the story of how the Miltons earned their eerie reputation on the mountain. I was only a kid when the terrible events happened, but I still remember what folks said over and over. Devil worshippers, witches, dark magic, demons, strange rituals, and the snake god. It was a chilling tale that stuck with me. The people who lived on the mountain claimed they found skulls, clean and white. Over a dozen of them inside the house once they finally worked up the nerve to go in. Evidence of divination, occult practices, blasphemies, and vulgar oaths had been written in blood on the walls, along with threatening warnings for anyone foolish enough to enter. The Miltons weren't what they seemed at first. Their family had been on the mountain as long as any, maybe longer. The grandfather was an odd man, raising 3 generations in that house until he suddenly passed away years ago. After that, the grandmother became the head of the household, and that's when the family grew more withdrawn, isolating themselves from the rest of the community. Even though they'd lived among us for decades and were once approachable, they were hardly ever seen at church, community events, or council meetings. They kept to themselves, stayed self-sufficient, and didn't buy or trade with others. That was unusual for mountain folk. Trading was how we got by. Meats, vegetables, hides, fat, firewood, oils. Everybody bartered, except the Miltons. They didn't trade, didn't sell, didn't buy. I can't remember a single time when anything passed between them and the rest of us. The night that changed the mountain forever was unexpected. A fire was reported near the Miltons' log cabin. Fire on a mountain in the fall is about the worst thing you can imagine. The dry leaves on the ground are like kindling, ready to set the whole world ablaze. By the time enough of us had gathered to fight the fire, the oddest thing happened. The flames were gone. The smoke that had set off them, alarms had vanished without a trace. I was just a teenager then, hard but naive, and nothing prepared me for what we found next. Behind the Miltons' home was a fire pit ringed with stones. The ground around it was scorched, blackened by a fire that had clearly burned there, but the ground wasn't even warm anymore. I'd never seen a fire burn out so fast. A deep, sick feeling weighed down my heart, a grief I couldn't understand yet. That feeling turned to horror when we found 2 small bodies charred in the pit. There was no question who they were. The Milton children, the youngest ones. Inside the house, things grew even worse. There was no doubt about what kind of evil had taken root inside that home. Books of black magic and demonology were stacked on shelves. Symbols were scrawled across the walls in dried blood. We found bones hidden under beds and in corners, human bones. In the parents' bedroom, Old Man and Old Lady Milton lay hand in hand, their throats slit clean from ear to ear. On the dresser nearby sat a spotless straight razor, polished and gleaming as if it had been placed there on purpose. The old woman was missing, at first. Then someone found her hanging from a rope in her bedroom, surrounded by ghastly trinkets, and the kind of filth you'd expect from a satanic temple. Over her bed hung a large inverted oak cross. Candles still burned in pools of wax on every surface. One of the men with us broke down sobbing when he found a lock of hair caught beneath the bed, his son's hair. His boy had gone missing 2 years before, and now it was clear what had happened. We cleared the cabin of every trace of the Miltons. Everything, furniture, books, clothing, was thrown into the fire pit where the children had been found and burned to ash. No one could say for sure whether the children had been burned alive or dead. Either way, the horror of it ate at the soul. A local pastor came up with other clergymen and anointed the property with holy oil. They prayed long and hard, covering the ground, the house, even the surrounding trees with blessings. It didn't seem to help. The trees that had been touched by the oil began to wither. Their leaves blackened and fell early. Their trunks hollowed out and rotted from within. No one wanted the wood and no one dared to cut them down. They still stand today, dead and gray, a scar against the living forest. Eventually, the house was boarded up, planks nailed across every window, tape stretched tight over every seam. The place was abandoned, left to rot. The only living thing we pulled out of that house was a black cat hiding under the kitchen cupboard. It wore a little bell around its neck that jingled with every trembling breath. I don't recall what became of that cat. That was 15 years ago. The memory of it all rushed back now as we climbed higher. the cabin drawing closer through the snow. Through the swirling white, I saw the shape of the Milton house emerge, broken and sagging, the boards across the windows battered and rotting, and in one of those boarded-up windows I saw it. A flicker, a faint, trembling light. We stopped cold. Maybe it was Rowan. Maybe it wasn't. The old Milton place loomed ahead, barely visible through the blowing snow, a rotten, sagging structure that should have fallen in on itself years ago. The roof bowed under the weight of the snow. The porch sagged so badly that it looked ready to snap. It was even worse than I remembered. The boards over the windows and doors had held, but time and weather had worn them down. Gaps yawned where the wood had split, leaving the house looking less like it was boarded up and more like it was trying to keep something in. I stepped up first, brushing snow off the porch with my boot. The boards creaked and moaned beneath my weight. Behind me, Jesse and Melvin hesitated at the edge of the clearing. "You sure about this?" Melvin asked, his breath misting in the cold air. "No," I answered honestly. "But Rowan might be inside. If he'd stumbled here, desperate for shelter, we couldn't leave him." I pounded on the door with the butt of my rifle. "Rowan, you in there?" Nothing. The wind whistled around us, carrying the faint sound of children laughing. Or maybe it was the wind itself, curling around the broken eaves and playing tricks on our ears. Jesse stepped up beside me, eyeing the house, like it might lunge at him. The doorknob was frozen solid. I pulled my axe from my belt and smashed it free with one heavy swing. Even then, the door barely budged. It was iced shut. Melvin came forward and put his shoulder to it. The door gave way with a sharp crack, swinging inward on splintered hinges. The stench hit us immediately. It wasn't just the smell of rot or mold, but of something old and foul. Something that had soaked into the walls and the very bones of the place. We hesitated on the threshold. The darkness inside was thicker than the night outside. Our flashlights cut narrow tunnels of light through the gloom, but even the beams seemed swallowed up by the house. Every step inside was an act of will. The house groaned and shifted under our feet. Dust motes swirled through the beams of our lights. Long, broken shadows crept across the walls as we moved. Somewhere deep in the house, something whispered. I froze. "You hear that?" I whispered to Jesse. He nodded, tight-lipped. The whispering grew louder the farther in we went. It wasn't the kind of sound you could pinpoint. A woman's voice rose, faint and rasping, seemingly coming from everywhere. The walls, the floors, the very air around us. "You have no reason to be here. We do not want you." The words slipped into my ears like needles. I gritted my teeth and pressed on. We pushed deeper into the house, room by room, our flashlights sweeping across long-forgotten furniture covered in sheets of dust and mold. Broken dishes littered the floor. Cobwebs draped from the ceiling in thick, sagging clumps. Then, we saw it. A figure at the end of the hallway, a shadow more solid than the rest, slipping through a doorway and vanishing. Without thinking, we ran after it, the hallway twisting and buckling beneath our feet all the while. Our flashlights flickered as we moved, struggling against the suffocating dark. We burst into the room, where the figure had gone. It was empty, except for the smell, sharp and metallic like blood, and the bone-deep certainty that something was still there just beyond the reach of our lights. I turned slowly in a circle, scanning the room. There was nothing but broken furniture and tattered curtains. "Where did it go?" Jesse whispered. I didn't answer. A low, hollow chuckle drifted through the house, as if the walls themselves were laughing. "We have to find Rowan," I said grimly. "And we have to find him fast." We packed kerosene, axes, and torches, and before the sun set again, we trudged back up the slope to finish what should have been done long ago. The closer we got, the heavier the air seemed. The house squatted in its clearing as if waiting to strike, its black windows glaring out at the world. We didn't hesitate. We soaked the porch, the walls, the roof, every inch of the place, with kerosene. The old wood drank it greedily. I struck the first match. The fire took hold immediately, leaping up the walls in hungry tongues of flame. The heat blasted against us even from a distance, and the house groaned as if alive, screaming its death cry into the sky. We watched without a word as the fire consumed it. Through the roar of the flames, I thought I heard something else, high. Wailing screams or maybe wild laughter. It was hard to tell. Maybe it was the wind. Or maybe it was something leaving that place for good. We stayed until the house collapsed in on itself, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. When the last of it was reduced to smoking ash, we turned and walked away, leaving behind only ruin and memory. By morning, the Milton place was nothing more than a blackened scar in the snow. The clearing stood silent, dead. We never spoke of it again. Some things are better left unsaid. But even now, years later, when the winter wind howls across the mountains and the snow falls heavy and blinding, sometimes I think I hear it. The faint, distant tinkle of a silver bell, lost somewhere in the woods. And I wonder if what we destroyed was truly the end, or only the beginning. The Black Bloom. I used to think dying towns just faded quietly, like old photographs left too long in the sun. But Langston Hollow didn't fade. It rotted. Every morning when I drove the cracked streets toward the library, I passed a dozen empty buildings. Their windows were boarded over or shattered, the plywood sagging like broken teeth. The gas station had closed last winter. The high school had shuttered 2 years before that. What few people remained walked with their heads down, moving from place to place like they were already halfway to their graves. I told myself it was just the economy. That was the easy lie we all told. The truth was, something worse had taken root here. Something we either didn't see or didn't want to name. I noticed the flower 2 days after Javier Jimenez died. The news hit the way every death did in Langston Hollow. First a ripple, then a drowning. Javier had been 17, full of two, much restless energy to waste time with caution. People said he had been trying to cut across the tracks, the way kids had done for years, even though the warning lights at the crossing had been out of order for months. I remembered seeing them flicker and die on my way home from work. I remembered thinking I should call someone, but I hadn't. It was easier to think someone else would. The afternoon after his funeral, I found myself parked near the old railway crossing without consciously deciding to go there. The air had a brittle, coppery tang, and the gravel lot beside the tracks felt as if it had been abandoned by everything living. I got out of the car, clutching a fistful of daisies I had picked from the cemetery grounds. Javier's memorial was already half-formed, a cluster of wilted flowers, a crooked wooden cross, a few glass candles, their wicks drowned in rainwater. I knelt awkwardly and added my daisies to the pile, feeling like a fraud. I had seen him skateboarding past the library just a week ago. He had smiled at me, lifted one hand in greeting. I had looked away. As I stood up, brushing dirt from my jeans, something caught my eye near the edge of the tracks. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a patch of dark soil maybe, or an old piece of rubber. But when I stepped closer, I saw it clearly. It was a flower. It grew straight up from the gravel bed, a slender black stalk supporting 5 curling petals, so dark they looked wet. The petals shimmered faintly, like oil on water, shifting from deepest black to bruised purple when the light hit them just right. The bloom rocked gently on its stem, even though the air was completely still. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't know a lot about plants, but I knew enough to understand that nothing should have been able to grow here. Not in the rocky bed between 2 rusting rails, not without soil or water or anything close to life. Without thinking, I knelt again, reaching out to touch the petals. The closer my hand got, the stronger the wrongness became. It wasn't the way the bloom looked, it was the way it felt. It watched me somehow, though it had no eyes. It leaned almost imperceptibly in my direction. I pulled back before my fingers could brush it. Standing quickly, I wiped my hands on my jeans as though I had touched something diseased. For a moment, I had the stupid thought that I needed to apologize to Javier, to the town, to the flower itself. The sun dipped lower behind the hills, painting the tracks in long golden slashes. I told myself I was tired. Grief did strange things to the mind, after all. Even so, when I turned back toward my car, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. The flower stood tall and still, waiting. I tried not to think about it over the next few days, but Langston Hollow made forgetting impossible. Javier's death hung in the air, saturating every conversation, every radio station, even the bulletin board at the library. Half the people blamed the town council for ignoring the broken signals. The other half blamed Javier himself for being careless. I blamed myself. At night, I found myself waking to strange dreams. I would be standing at the tracks again, looking down at the black flower. But when I reached to pluck it from the ground, the petals curled into a mouth and whispered, "My name." I stopped sleeping much after that. By the end of the week, 2 more black flowers had appeared. One at the corner where Mrs. Banning's car had flipped and caught fire after the stoplight shorted out. Another near the entrance to the shuttered textile mill where a homeless man had been found hanging from a steel beam. I didn't have to look for them. It was like the town wanted me to see them. Every time a siren howled, I would find myself hours later, standing somewhere near the edge of another tragedy, staring down at another impossible bloom. Each one looked identical, black as tar, flickering, faintly with purples and greens when the light struck just right. Each one moved in air that wasn't there. Each one seemed to lean toward me when I got close. I told no one. Not yet. If I said the flowers were wrong, they would say I was being overly sensitive. If I said they were following me, they would say I needed rest. Maybe they would have been right. Maybe I should have listened. Instead, I started to believe something else, something much worse. That the flowers weren't just marks of death, that they were invitations, and sooner or later, they would expect me to answer. Part 2. There is a kind of silence that only comes after grief. It is not peace, it is vacancy. Langston Hollow lived inside that silence now. Every day I watched more people leave town. Those who stayed carried themselves as if waiting for something to come and finish the job. By the time the second week passed after Javier's death, I had counted 6 more black blooms. The flowers never appeared immediately. First came the tragedy, a house fire, a sudden heart attack, a drowning in a flooded basement. Then, after a day or two, the bloom would sprout somewhere nearby, as if the ground needed time to digest what had happened. I stopped sleeping entirely. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the empty streets at night, telling myself I was just restless. In truth, I was hunting. I wanted to catch one of the blooms growing. I needed to know if they were born the way natural things were, pushing up through the dirt, or if they simply appeared. I never caught them in the act. They were always just there. One evening, I found myself parked outside the old gas station. It had closed the previous winter, when the last owner packed up and moved to Dallas. The pumps stood like rusted skeletons under a sagging canopy, their paint scabbed and flaking. A black bloom grew between the cracks in the concrete island where cars had once fueled up. Its petals fluttered lazily, even though the night was as still as glass. I should have been used to them by then. Instead, the sight drove a spike of cold dread through me. I stayed in the car, hands gripping the steering wheel, until my knuckles ached. The flower seemed to vibrate faintly at the edge of my vision, and for a moment I could almost hear it. Not a voice exactly, a vibration, a hum, tuned perfectly to the frequency of my guilt. I squeezed my eyes shut and leaned back against the seat, forcing myself to relax. I did not remember starting the car again. I only remembered the sound of gravel crunching under the tires as I pulled away, leaving the bloom swaying in the rearview mirror. I needed answers, and Deputy Travis Altenberg was the only person I trusted enough to talk to. He met me late, that Friday night at the diner, which still managed to keep its doors open despite the town's decline. We sat in a back booth, the vinyl seats cracked and stuffing poking through the seams. The overhead light flickered every few minutes, but neither of us commented on it. Travis listened patiently as I spoke. I told him about the flowers, the timing, and how they seemed to call to me. When I finished, he stirred his coffee with slow, careful motions. His face was unreadable, but the way he avoided meeting my eyes said enough. "Justine," he said, setting the spoon down, "you've been through a lot lately. We all have. It's natural to look for patterns when everything feels out of control." "I'm not imagining them," I said. My voice cracked, so I lowered it. "They're real, Travis. I can show you." He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. I could tell he wanted to believe me, but belief came with a price most people were unwilling to pay. It was easier to pretend the world made sense. "Maybe you're right," he said finally, offering a half smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Maybe there's a logical explanation. Fungi, maybe. Some kind of mold growing in weird conditions. You know how messed up the soil's been since the flood 3 years ago." I wanted to argue, but the words dried up in my throat. He meant, well, he always had. But Travis saw the town through a window he refused to open, too afraid of what might blow inside. I left the diner feeling more alone than ever. Sunday morning, I sat stiffly on a hard pew in the old church, trying to listen as Pastor Abigail Cole gave her sermon. Only about a dozen people were scattered across the sanctuary, most of them older women in shapeless dresses and sensible shoes. Their heads bobbed occasionally in half-hearted agreement, but their eyes remained glassy and distant. The building itself felt weary. The wooden beams overhead sagged, the stained glass windows dulled by years of dust. The air smelled of old hymnals and mildew. Pastor Cole spoke about sorrow that takes root in the soil of the heart, about bitterness that grows unchecked when no one tends the garden of their soul. I heard the words, but I felt them too, heavy and sticky in the back of my throat. She talked about how grief, if left to rot, could poison everything it touched. Her voice was soft, but it filled the empty spaces as though the church itself was listening. I did not remember rising at the end of the service. I only remembered finding myself standing alone at the altar steps while the last parishioners shuffled out. Pastor Cole approached quietly, her hands folded before her, her eyes kind but wary. "You see them, don't you?" she said. I stared at her, unsure if I had heard her correctly. Before I could answer, she placed a hand on my shoulder. "Be careful what you uproot," she whispered. "Some sorrows need a place to die." Then she walked away, leaving the scent of old wood and fading lilacs in her wake. That night, I pulled every old book I could find from the library's neglected folklore section. Dust rose in clouds with each volume I opened, making me cough and blink in the dim light. Titles blurred together: Gardens of the Dead, Botanica Obscura, The Weeping, Fields. Most of the accounts were fractured, more rumor than fact. Stories about cursed flowers that marked the sites of betrayal, murder, and despair. Tales from places no longer found on maps where sorrow had grown wild and choked out everything else. One passage, scrawled in the margins of an otherwise forgotten book, stuck with me. "Where grief takes root, beware. Pull the weed too soon, and its seeds shall scatter on the wind." I sat alone in the library long after midnight, the books piled high around me, the ancient clock on the wall ticking with mechanical indifference. The more I read, the more I realized the black blooms were not visitors. They were symptoms. Symptoms of something the town had been nursing for a long time without realizing it. I thought about the boarded houses, the crumbling streets, the steady procession of tragedies. Langston Hollow was not just dying. It was being eaten, and the blooms were the teeth. I drove home with the heater blasting against the chill that seemed to have taken up permanent residence inside my bones. As I passed the corner of Main and Shiloh, I caught sight of another bloom. This one had grown up through the asphalt itself, right in the center of the deserted intersection. Its petals glistened under the streetlights, as black as tar. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, refusing to slow down or look directly at it. But even with my eyes on the road, I knew it leaned toward me as I passed, knew it could feel me, knew it was waiting. The night I decided to pull the flower, the sky hung low and gray, the stars smothered by heavy clouds. The air tasted like rust. I paced my living room for hours before making the decision. My thoughts twisted in circles but always returned to the same truth. The blooms were multiplying. If something did not stop them, they would swallow what little remained of Langston Hollow. I convinced myself that if I could destroy the first bloom, the one by the tracks where Javier died, maybe the others would wither with it. Maybe I could still save something. I left the house just after midnight. I dressed in dark clothes and wore gloves, even though it felt ridiculous. I did not tell anyone where I was going. If I failed, I did not want an audience. The streets were unnervingly silent. When I reached the railroad crossing, I killed the Idadi headlights and rolled to a stop. The track stretched out before me, two thin scars cutting across the dead landscape. The makeshift memorial still stood to one side, battered by the wind. Someone had left a new bouquet of silk roses there. Their colors looked lurid and wrong in the weak moonlight. The black bloom waited near the rails precisely where I remembered it. I approached slowly, my boots crunching against the gravel, each step feeling harder than the last. When I reached the flower, I hesitated. Up close, it was even worse than I remembered. The smell rising from it was not floral, but damp and metallic. The surface of the flower's petals was slick, and they were trembling. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to kneel. The ground beneath the bloom looked ordinary, loose stones and dirt packed hard by decades of trains rumbling past. But when I brushed the surface aside, the soil below was not brown or gray. It was black, slick, and clotted, like oil mixed with ashes. The bloom shivered as my gloved fingers dug into the dirt around its base. I gritted my teeth and pulled. At first, nothing happened. The stalk resisted, anchored deep below the surface. I shifted my grip and yanked harder, and the bloom tore free with a wet sound that made bile rise in my throat. Its roots dangled from the end of the stalk, long black tendrils covered in thorn-like protrusions. Thick drops of viscous black sap oozed from the torn roots, hissing faintly as they hit the ground. Instantly, the silence shattered. In the distance, I heard the wail of sirens. For one moment, I crouched there in the gravel, the dead bloom in my hand, my lungs frozen in my chest. The sound grew louder, filling the hollow night with urgency. I dropped the bloom and stumbled back. The sap clung to my gloves, sticky and black, refusing to let go. I tore the gloves off and hurled them away, wiping my hands furiously on my jeans. Even though nothing remained, the sirens kept coming. I did not hesitate. I rushed to the car, fumbling twice before jamming the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I peeled away from the tracks, headlights slicing through the darkness. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the sirens had nothing to do with me, that I had not just done something terribly wrong. When I reached Main Street, I saw the lights. Red and blue strobed against the sides of buildings, washing the empty storefronts in color. A police cruiser skidded around a corner up ahead, its tires screeching against the pavement. Instinct guided me to follow. I kept a safe distance, my fingers digging into the steering wheel so hard my hands ached. They led me to the bridge. The old Trinity Bridge spanned the narrow river at the north end of town. It had been deemed unsafe years ago, but no one had bothered to enforce the closure beyond putting up a few flimsy barriers. A commuter bus, the kind that ferried workers between Langston Hollow and the neighboring cities, hung at an impossible angle halfway off the bridge. Its headlights pointed uselessly into the river below. Crumpled metal and shattered glass littered the roadway. I parked at the edge of the chaos. Moments later, emergency workers swarmed the scene. Some carried stretchers. Others climbed into the listing bus, their reflective gear flashing in the lights. Voices crackled over radios. Commands shouted. Someone sobbed openly nearby. I stepped out of the car, moving like a sleepwalker. An officer waved me back, but I barely heard him. I stood behind the yellow tape, staring, while the truth carved itself into my brain. There had been no bus accident here yesterday. No bloom to mark it. But there would be now. My gaze drifted instinctively to the cracked pavement near the bridge entrance. There was no bloom yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. I pressed a hand to my mouth to stifle the sob that clawed its way up my throat. I had not destroyed the flower. I had only moved its hunger. I fled the scene before anyone could ask questions. Back in my car, I drove aimlessly for hours, the highway unfolding before me like a thread I could never quite unravel. Every exit sign, every dark field, every hollow house pressed against my windows, whispering my failure. The sun rose pale and sickly over the fields by the time I turned back toward Langston Hollow. I expected to feel guilt, or sorrow, or despair. Instead, what I felt was colder and sharper, inevitability. The flowers were not just marking death, they were cultivating it, and I had helped them grow. By the end of the following week, 3 more blooms had appeared, one at the hospital parking lot, after the ER flooded and several patients died. One outside the grocery store, where a man shot his brother in broad daylight over an argument no one understood. One at the playground, closed for years, where a teenager had hanged herself from the broken swing set. Each bloom stood taller than the last. Each one seemed to lean a little farther toward the living. I stopped pretending the town would survive. Langston Hollow had been crumbling for years. The black blooms were simply the final harvest. I sat at the kitchen table that night, staring at a map of the town spread out before me. I had marked every bloom I had seen with a small black dot. Looking at them now, I saw a pattern forming, a slow inward spiral, a tightening noose. At the center of the spiral, there was only one place left untouched. The cemetery. The place where I worked part-time. The place where it had all begun. I knew what I would find there. Knew it the same way I knew the smell of rot, even before opening a dead flower's petals. Some things you did not need to see to understand. The blooms were calling me home. The cemetery gates groaned when I pushed them open. Their iron frames, twisted with vines of rust, screeched in protest before yielding just enough for me to slip through. I stood for a moment on the gravel path, breathing in the damp, metallic air. The scent was heavier than usual, thick with the faint, sour rot of something turning beneath the soil. I tightened my jacket around me and stepped forward. The Carrington family cemetery sprawled over a small hill at the edge of town. Rows of crooked headstones jutted from the earth, their inscriptions faded and worn smooth by decades of rain and neglect. In daylight, the place felt abandoned but harmless, a monument to forgotten names. At night, it felt like the town's last stubborn heartbeat, and even that rhythm had grown feeble. I moved between the graves, my boots scuffing against gravel and dead leaves. The flashlight in my hand jittered with every step, the beam slicing through the mist in thin, wavering lines. I didn't know exactly what I expected to find, but I knew it would be there. I passed the graves of people I had known, old neighbors, teachers, friends' parents, and tried not to look at the newer ones. Each name was a pinprick in my memory, a reminder that Langston Hollow's best days were buried in the ground alongside its dead. Halfway up the hill, I found it. A black bloom swayed atop a grave near the center of the cemetery. It was larger than any I had seen before, its petals almost grotesquely wide as if drinking in the moonlight. The roots sprawled across the soil in a tangled mat, darkening the ground like a spreading infection. I raised the flashlight and read the name etched into the headstone. Rebecca M. Carrington. My mother. I staggered back 2 steps, the flashlight, beam jerking wildly across the surrounding stones. I had not visited her grave in months. The sudden, sickening weight of guilt overcame me as I remembered the long, slow days of her illness. The way I had shrunk away from her in those final weeks, avoiding the hospital, making excuses about work and exhaustion when the truth was simpler. I could not stand to watch her fade. I had abandoned her when it mattered most. And now something had taken root in the hollow left behind. The bloom bent toward me slightly as if acknowledging my thoughts. I backed away. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the thing growing from my mother's grave. But my legs locked in place, unwilling or unable to obey. It was not alone. As my breathing steadied enough to lift the flashlight again, I saw the others. Small black shoots had begun to sprout across the hilltop, thin and skeletal, barely visible, in the mist. They grew from graves at random, no pattern that I could see, no clear connection between the names. They swayed together like a field of tiny metronomes, ticking out some silent, terrible rhythm. The flowers had done more than spread to the cemetery. They had claimed it entirely. I stumbled back to my car and sat in the driver's seat with my hands gripping the wheel, cold sweat prickling the back of my neck. I did not start the engine. I simply sat there, staring at the twisted shadows beyond the gate, trying to gather the frayed threads of my mind into something resembling coherence. There was no salvaging this, no calling it a coincidence or a hallucination, no rationalizing it as grief or madness. The black blooms were real and they were growing stronger. They were no longer content to wait passively for sorrow to feed them. They were now reaching for it. I thought about the pattern I had marked on the map, the slow, spiraling approach inward. I thought about the warnings hidden in the old folklore texts. I thought about Pastor Cole. I needed answers, and I needed them now. The church stood crooked and empty when I arrived. Its front doors hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. The stained glass windows were dark, the parking lot cracked and overgrown. A single light flickered behind the altar, casting long, wavering shadows across the sanctuary. I hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. Pastor Abigail Cole knelt in prayer at the front pew. She did not turn when I entered, nor did she acknowledge the sound of my boots on the worn wooden floor. I approached slowly, unsure whether I was interrupting something sacred or whether the sanctity had long since fled. "Pastor," I said, my voice thin and rough. She finished her prayer with a murmured amen and rose, turning to face me. Her expression was not surprised. It was weary, as if she had been expecting me all along. "You've seen them," she said simply. I nodded. Pastor Cole gestured toward the pews, and we sat facing each other across the empty aisle. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she sighed and folded her hands in her lap. "This has happened before," she said. "Not here, not in Langston Hollow, but elsewhere. Places the world has forgotten. Towns that dried up and blew away like dead leaves." "Why?" My voice cracked under the weight of the question. "What are they?" "Grief," she said. "Regret. Every sorrow we bury without healing, every wound we ignore, it all seeps into the ground. And sometimes when there's enough of it, when the land has suffered too long without kindness, something grows." She met my gaze with steady, sorrowful eyes. "The blooms are the children of our failures," she said. "And once they take root, they do not stop until there is nothing left to feed them." I sat back against the pew, the words sinking into me. "I tried to stop it," I said. "I pulled one of them out. I trailed off, rising shame robbing me of my resolve." Pastor Cole shook her head. "You cannot uproot sorrow," she said. "You can only contain it, accept it. Tend it like a wounded thing until it dies on its own." I thought about the sirens, the bridge, the broken bodies pulled from the wreckage. "What happens now?" I asked. She looked toward the stained glass windows where moonlight struggled to pierce the grime. "Now it finishes what it started," she said. I left the church without speaking further. There was nothing more to say. The town was collapsing. I saw it clearly now, as if some veil had been stripped away. Fires broke out in abandoned homes. Accidents and fights erupted in the streets. People disappeared without a trace, leaving only empty houses and unanswered questions behind. Everywhere I turned, the black blooms grew thicker, rising in cracks and gutters, curling around mailboxes and lampposts. Their roots crisscrossed the pavement like veins, binding the town in a web of inevitable decay. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe they did, and chose blindness over terror. The few who remained walked through the streets with hollow eyes, their movements mechanical, as if already resigned to the end. I understood, because I was no different. I had tried to intervene. I had tried to pull the sorrow out by its roots. But in the end, all I had done was scatter it wider. Langston Hollow was dying, and I was its last willing witness. By the time I made the decision, Langston Hollow was no longer a town. It was a carcass. The streets lay empty except for the black, vines creeping across the cracked pavement. Houses sagged inward on themselves, roofs caving under the weight of unseen rot. Smoke rose from distant fires no one bothered to extinguish. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with the smell of ash and wet earth. The people who could leave had fled. Those who stayed no longer looked at each other. No one spoke. No one tried to fight it anymore. They understood the way I understood. The Blooms had won. I found Deputy Travis Altenberg outside the station house, sitting on the hood of his patrol car with a shotgun resting across his knees. He looked up as I approached but did not smile. His face was pale and hollow. His eyes ringed with sleeplessness. He looked like a man who had been standing guard over a battlefield long after the war had ended. "You should get out," he rasped. "While you still can." I shook my head. "You can't run from it," I said. "It follows." He nodded once, the barest dip of his chin, and said nothing more. We stood together for a few minutes in the heavy silence. Then I turned and walked away. I never looked back. The cemetery gates were already open when I arrived. I stepped through and followed the gravel path up the hill, past the crooked stones and the spreading mat of black vines. The ground felt soft and unstable under my boots, as if it no longer remembered how to be solid. At the top of the hill, near the oldest graves, I found a bloom larger than any before. Its glistening petals towered above the headstones, wide and curling. The stem was as thick as a man's wrist, its roots sprawling in every direction. It grew from an open grave. I didn't need to read the headstone to know whose name was carved on it. Still, I forced myself to look. Justine Carrington. There was no date beneath it, no beginning or end. Only my name, etched in deep, final strokes. The smell of rot and sorrow coiled around me, sharp enough to sting my eyes as I stepped closer. The bloom bent toward me, its petals trembling slightly as if anticipating my arrival. I dropped to my knees at the grave's edge, and for a moment, I simply sat there, breathing in the foul, heavy air, letting it fill my lungs. There was no anger in me, no fear. Only the cold, steady weight of understanding. I had abandoned too much and allowed too much to fester. The blooms had not created the sorrow, they had only revealed it. The fault had always been ours. It had always been mine. I closed my eyes and leaned forward until my palms rested against the cold, wet earth. The bloom's shadow fell over me, blotting out the thin moonlight. I heard it whisper then, not in words, but in a deep vibration that thrummed through the ground, through my bones, through the broken spaces inside me. And I surrendered to it. The petals brushed my shoulders, soft and cold as silk. The roots wound around my arms and legs, pulling me gently, insistently, into the grave's waiting. Mouth I did not fight or cry out. Instead, I let the earth take me. As the darkness swallowed me, I thought I felt something shift in the town beyond the cemetery gates. A subtle easing, a slackening of the invisible cords pulling everything down. Maybe in giving myself back to the soil, I had bought Langston Hollow a little more time. Maybe. Long after I was gone, after the fires burned out, and the last few survivors rebuilt what they could, a child playing near the old church found a strange flower sprouting between the stones. A tiny bloom, black and glistening, waited swaying gently where no wind blew.